Thank you to everyone here for attending. It's been a long day. I think this is the last session. I'm going to break this session into two parts. First of all, I'm planning to talk for about half an hour, give a relatively short presentation, and then I'm hoping that that will prompt you to share some ideas and we can finish the day off with a bit of a discussion at the end. Okay, let's see if we can share the screen. This is my topic, practical ideas for using technology to create a better approach to educational delivery. Very topical. Now, several years ago, I was on the PTA committee of this school here in Hong Kong, which both my daughters attended. It's called Clearwater Bay School. And one day in a PTA committee meeting, pretty much out of the blue, the management announced that every classroom in the school would be equipped with an interactive whiteboard before the end of the academic year. And that was just 6 months off. Well, these boards were pretty expensive. At that time, you wouldn't get much change out of 10,000 Australian dollars for one. Multiply that by 25 classrooms and you're talking serious money. Not only that, they were going to send 2 teachers to London for a week's training. And of course, that doesn't come cheap either. So the school was going to pay for part of this project, but there was a shortfall and the PTA was tasked with a massive, and I mean massive, fundraising operation. And I have to say, we were successful and the project went ahead and every single classroom was equipped with a board. Now, 5 years later, I was making a visit to the school and what did I see? Yes, the teachers were using these IWBs, they were wielding the digital pens, but they were only using them as pens. They were projecting from the laptop, but they were only using the whiteboard as a screen. So what this meant was, the outcome was that the whiteboards were not interactive whiteboards anymore. They were just whiteboards. And we had funded the most expensive whiteboards in the world. That's pretty depressing, isn't it? But I doubt whether anybody watching is surprised. I'm absolutely sure that all of you have similar stories of EdTech failures to tell. And maybe that's why you're here attending this talk today. So what I want to do is to highlight 3 cases of EdTech project failures, to look at 3 lessons we can learn from them, and then to turn these lessons into guidelines for success. And finally, we'll contextualize these guidelines by looking at a project that's gone well at another school here in Hong Kong. And by the way, I want to make it clear that when it comes to the 3 failures, I'm not in any way pointing the finger at anyone or any institution, because in failing, I think these institutions should be seen as the norm rather than the exception. And we need to learn from these past failures to turn them into future successes. Okay, case number 2. At the beginning of last year, just a month before the pandemic struck, I visited a British Council teaching centre in Southeast Asia. First, a bit of background. So we at Clarity, as some of you may know, have a long-term partnership with the British Council globally to publish this programme, Road to IELTS, which is the official British Council online IELTS prep course. So the project started in 2006 and the idea was to create an online resource. So, well, actually it was initially a CD-ROM resource, but it turned into an online resource so that British Council IELTS candidates could feel more confident with the nature of the exam, could try out some of the pretty unusual task types that you find in IELTS, could watch videos from British Council teachers, and could do practice papers. And both sides, both co-publishers in this project, the British Council and Clarity, researched the needs of the test takers, and we researched the needs of the institutions that would be using the programme, including schools, universities, and public libraries. So this time we're not talking about a waste of money in the same way as we were with the first project. Now, on this visit in January last year, my objective was to see how Road to IELTS was actually being used in the IELTS prep classes in the teaching centre. And what I discovered was it wasn't being used at all. The teachers who wanted to use online materials had been given pretty much free rein to do whatever they liked. They didn't have time to research online resources properly, and each teacher was doing their own thing, and they were all using websites that they'd chosen themselves. Let's look at some examples. That's a lot of websites, isn't it? So some of these websites are perfectly good, but the teachers were also finding some pretty questionable stuff too, maybe stuff with loads of ads in it, maybe stuff that's just not reliable. And the management was getting worried about quality control. And I'm sitting there in the meeting, hearing all this, and I'm thinking, hang on, you've just spent 15 years developing a top-of-the-range course that's actually yours. So what's going on here? And it was pretty clear to me that, or thinking about it afterwards, it was pretty clear that there was an issue of a lack of guidance and a lack of institutional support. Teachers simply weren't aware that they had access to Road to IELTS. So that's EdTech failure number 2. On to my third and final example, which is a little bit closer to home. Earlier this year, I was talking with a teacher at a university in Queensland. There she is. This was during the pandemic, of course, back in January, perhaps February, and all the classes were online. So the teachers had been set up on Zoom with students not just in Australia, but Australia and East Asia, which of course are the usual destinations, but right across the world, as far as West Africa and even South America. That's a great thing, of course. And the university was able to reach out to students who would not normally have been able to come to Australia in person. But it does add the extra burden of time differences and sleepy students onto the teacher's workload. So this University Language Centre, the teachers were expected to give hour-long Zoom classes. That's 1 solid hour in front of the students. The teacher I was talking to had tried group work by putting students into Zoom breakout rooms, but she discovered that the students just sat there and said nothing. There they are. Now, doing a class, as I'm sure a great number of you are aware, doing a class like this for an hour is bad enough. But when you've got 4 or 5 classes in a day, it's shattering. You end up with students who aren't learning very much and demoralized teachers. So this is EdTech project failure number 3. So number 1 is the whiteboards, number 2 is the online IELTS prep resources, and number 3 is the Zoom teaching. Okay, as I've said, we shouldn't feel surprised by IT-related failures. After all, these don't just happen in education. Let's look at some headlines that will look very familiar. So yeah, there we are. So we shouldn't be surprised, but we should feel bad about it, because when we allow a failure to take place, we are robbing institutions, teachers, and students of a positive outcome and substituting a negative one. And it's actually a little bit worse than that, because we're also reinforcing the expectation that tech is likely to fail. And as you can see from the collage on the screen, there is a very real expectation of failure. So what can we learn from these three cases? Well, what I want to do is to isolate a single cause of failure for each one, and to look at how this can be avoided in future. Now, of course, the causes of failure are far more complex, but focusing on a single one is useful in looking for lessons to learn, and from that to devising solutions and guidelines that can take us forward. Right, case one, the interactive whiteboards. Cause of failure. In my opinion, one of the main causes of failure was ego. The school wanted to look good. A primary motivation, looking back at it, was that they wanted to show that they had all the latest technology, that they were a cutting-edge school. Case number two, IELTS prep. The problem I'd like to highlight here was the lack of guidance for teachers, and therefore lack of control over the project itself. As I've said before, there was a failure of institutional support. Perhaps this is more understandable in a very large institution with multiple operations all over the world, like the British Council. But nevertheless, it's true that the less guidance a project stakeholders have, the more likely the project is to get into trouble. Case three, the Zoom teaching, the third case, Zoom teaching in Queensland. This was a failure of change management, a failure of professional development. As we all know, the situation changed pretty quickly, pretty much overnight actually, from face-to-face teaching to remote teaching. And the management's initial reaction was, okay, let's shift to Zoom. That'll save the day. Okay, that's fine, but there was no proper follow-up to ensure that what would save the day in the short term would be a sustainable model for successful educational delivery in the medium and long term. So let's turn to the question of how we can avoid making these mistakes in the future. And I'd like to kind of spin these lessons around and turn them into three guidelines that need to be in place for any successful EdTech project. Let's go back first to the Clearwater Bay School and the interactive whiteboards case. What was the question for which interactive whiteboards were the answer? And was that question ever asked or even defined? When it comes to EdTech projects, I think it's useful to take a big step back and make sure that we understand the role, or the multiple roles rather, of tech in the first place. And only once we have this broad picture in our mind can we look at a specific project in its correct context. You may have seen this activity before, but there's a simple genius about this activity devised by Pete Sharma, the teacher trainer in the UK. Many years ago in a book called CD-ROM, A Teacher's Handbook. That tells you how old it is. But it goes to the heart of why and when we should use tech. So you simply draw a grid on the board like this. And on one side you write role of the teacher. And on the other side you write role of technology, or in this case, role of the interactive whiteboard. Now you can do this to think about technology in general, but as we're focusing on 3 different cases, we're going to focus on the whiteboards. I'm going to be silent now for 15 seconds, just 15 seconds. And just by looking at this grid, I'm sure you will start asking yourself, actually, what are the benefits of using an IWB? Okay, that's just 15 seconds. So see if you can think of one idea. Let's start now. You can write in the chat if you like. Okay, we're already yeah, great. We're already seeing ideas. So you've probably, well, okay, get students moving, independent group work, yeah. They're multi-sensory, more engaging. They're good for reviewing lessons, storing what you've done in the lessons, whatever. But I'm sure you can see how to do multidimensional. Loads of great stuff, and that's just 15 seconds worth. So I'm sure you can see how to do this activity. Get the stakeholders into a session. Get them to do it individually. Move on to pair work to share ideas, group work, plenary session. You will be amazed by the ideas that come out of the discussion. And of course, here we're just focusing on IWBs, but it would work equally well for exam preparation, the IELTS project, or remote teaching on Zoom. And that's the 3 projects that we're discussing today. And then when you're 3 months, if you're running a pilot, when you're 3 months, which of course for most projects, most large projects you should, when you're 3 months into the pilot, do it again, and you'll get a whole load of fresh ideas. So doing a proper needs analysis, and this is obviously just one part of a needs analysis. One of the benefits of a needs analysis is that it will lead to buy-in from the stakeholders, and that is essential for the next question. Is participation in this project by the teachers voluntary or compulsory? As teachers, you know, we see ourselves as individualists. We cherish the idea of doing our own thing in our own classroom. I know what works for me and for my students. That's us as teachers. But as managers or project leaders, we need to recognize that for an EdTech project to succeed, it usually can't be voluntary. To put it another way, there must be a high degree of institutional guidance so that people are not just working together, but they're seen to be working together. So this is an interesting one, and I'm sure you recognize the concept. But let me give you an example from my own office here at Clarity, because of course we fail in our EdTech projects too, or in our tech projects in this case. 3 years ago, we introduced a time tracker for management and staff. The reason for this was that we needed to know how much time we spent on different aspects of projects so that we could more accurately allocate resources for the future. That was one reason. Secondly, when a member of staff had 2 roles, let's say they were working on, say they were a technical person working on technical support and the website, well, they needed to know how much time they were spending on each. So we asked everyone to put their data in at the end of the day, and they did. And there was a high level of compliance, 95% level of acceptance of this project, which exceeded what we had expected. And in general, people were pretty supportive and they thought it was useful. Now, this year, we reviewed the system and we decided that there were some people for whom this was not useful or relevant. Perhaps they only had one task to work on, or their job wasn't project related, or whatever it was. So we decided that these people didn't have to do it anymore. Now, what happened next? Well, you can guess everyone stopped doing it. Even those people who genuinely found it useful and were required to do it stopped doing it. It was very much all or nothing. This is pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? This all or nothing. I mean, why should that be the case? Well, without going into too much detail, we can understand what's happening through organizational psychology. Within a group, for all sorts of reasons, group members will adhere to social norms. Once these behaviors cease to be norms, well, it's much less important to stick to the rules anymore. And that's why it stops working. That's adhesion to social norms is not something we can change. It's evolutionary psychology. It's hardwired. So it is something we need to recognize. So that's one reason why lesson 1, the needs analysis, where you get everybody involved, is so important. You need buy-in because you need to make the initiative compulsory within the group. And making it, whatever it is, a social norm gives all sorts of other benefits too. So firstly, and let's see if I can get the next slide up. Firstly, it saves resources. So in the IELTS example, there would never have been any question of time spent researching multiple websites because one website would have been chosen. Training can be streamlined and standardized. Thirdly, it ensures quality. It means that you can subject the solution you've chosen to quality control. And ultimately, it just means that it can work. It can be a success. But it can only really work well with the proper professional development. Over the last 18 months, far too many teachers have been put in front of a Zoom screen with no more than a functional training in Zoom itself, not a pedagogical training, a functional training. And they've been expected to just get on with it. So lesson 3 is that management needs to provide appropriate and adequate professional development. And really, this should not need to be said, especially here in the education sector, but it does. So let's consider those 3 guidelines. So firstly, conduct a needs analysis. Secondly, make the initiative a norm. And thirdly, run adequate professional development. Right, so far we have looked at 4 projects, including the Clarity project, 4 projects which ultimately failed, which, apart from being a bit gloomy, tells us only that the absence of the criteria we've isolated can lead to failure. But what we really need to know, of course, is that their presence will lead to success. So let's finish up with a success story. Now, of course, life is not neat and tidy, so this is not going to be a perfect fit, but nevertheless, these 3 elements I've identified are all present in the case study I'm going to describe. Right, Shung Tak Catholic Education College. It's in the Hong Kong New Territories. It's a Band 1 secondary school. Here it is. Let's have a look. Band 1's the highest of the 3 bands for Hong Kong schools. So it's an English medium school, and it's got a good reputation as a really high-flying, go-ahead institution. And I'm going to tell you the story of their successful Ed Tech project. It's a bit of a beacon, in my opinion. So as with all projects, it started with a problem, an issue identified by the English teachers. So the English teachers felt that students going into the final year needed to improve their study skills, both for their final exams and for their university careers thereafter. Okay, as we all know, 95% of students, maybe 99% of students need to improve their academic study skills. And of course, the teachers at Shung Tak had been aware of this, but they were highlighting it now, which was, I say now, this was about a year ago, because the pandemic had brought it to a head. The school had been closed for 6 months. Students were studying alone, stuck on their own. And so study skills were even more important than ever. Right, let me introduce Miss Aubrey Kwan, who's in charge of this project. Here she is. Now, crucially, the first thing that she and the other teachers did was to conduct a needs analysis. They thought they wanted an online academic study skills program, but is that actually what they needed? And if so, how could they choose the one that would best meet those needs? So the needs analysis that they conducted covered 2 main areas. Firstly, the content and the skills they needed to help students with. So, for example, they identified independent learning. Obviously, that's a really vital one in the context of the pandemic, as is critical thinking. And there were others, such as giving a presentation, and others too. Okay, so that's an example of the content areas, but as well as the content, they worked to identify the nature of the resource that would be most likely to succeed. So first of all, it had to be engaging, obviously because the students will be working on it alone. It needed to have authentic texts. It needed to be easily accessible, as support would be remote with the students at home and the support team at school. So by the end of this process, they knew pretty much what they were looking for, and they were able to draw up a checklist, including the content items and the items relating to the nature of the resource. Then they researched a number of candidate resources and were able to measure each of them against the points on the checklist they'd compiled. That's objective, but it was important that it went beyond an objective ticking of boxes. So it was seen as very important that teachers knew their students and were able to make judgments based on what they knew subjectively that their students would find difficult or easy. And that meant they were able to pick something. They had agency to pick something that was relevant and at the right level. Okay, they finally settled on a program called Study Skills Success, actually, which we publish here at Clarity. So I know all about this. And so that was step 1, the successful implementation of the needs analysis and deciding on the resource they were going to use. The next step was PD, professional development, or familiarization, as they called it. There were 2 sides to this. Firstly, familiarizing the teachers with the resource, and secondly, discussing collaboratively how best to implement it or deploy it. So one of the tools they used for step 1 was a PD resource that comes with Study Skills Success. It comes on the website. It's a worksheet entitled Getting to Know the Program. A simple old-fashioned paper-based worksheet. So in a 40-minute PD session, teachers get into pairs and they answer the 14 questions you can see on the worksheet. To do this, they have to access the program. And once they've got in, they need to explore both the functionality and the content. And then the final question on the right there with lots of lines is ideas about how to implement it with their students. So by the time they've been through this, this means that they're going to feel very confident with using the program. And it's it's obvious that this will increase the chances of it being used successfully, isn't it? Okay, on the second point, which is how to deploy the program with students, they came up with a rather ingenious idea. They were going to start to use the program in term 1, which here is in September, end of August, beginning of September. So they gave students a simple task to do over the summer holidays. All they had to do was try one exercise from each of the 10 units of study skills success. And the idea was that by the time they returned to school, they'd feel comfortable with the program. But the teachers went one step further in order to reinforce this familiarization. So at the beginning of term, each teacher gave one in-class introductory session. And this was so students could explore the program together and to ask questions or raise any issues that had come up during the holidays. And Ms. Kwan decided to do this not in a computer lab. She asked the students to whip out their mobile phones in class and try an exercise right there and then. And this was to show the students they could truly use the program anytime and anywhere. This is great, isn't it? This is brilliant. This is absolutely textbook conception and execution with no corners cut. On the third and final issue of institutional guidance and of making this a mandatory resource, well, you can see that this box is already partially ticked. So involving the teachers in the needs analysis process gave them an investment in using the program. But they went a bit further and they took two more important measures. Firstly, cross-referencing with the curriculum. Okay, this is not actually their real curriculum, which I don't have access to, but it's a simple example of how to cross-reference items in one syllabus with those in another. So for example, when students were due to give presentations, this cross-referencing would easily enable Ms. Kwan or her colleagues to assign them the speaking unit to improve their presentation skills before the relevant class. Or prior to the mock exams, the syllabus would cross-reference with the independent learning unit, which deals with preparing for an exam. And the school also attached the program usage to the students' end of year report card. It didn't affect their grades, but it did note their progress through study skills success. And it was mandatory. So this, of course, reinforces the importance that the teachers as a group attach to the usage of the program. Right, well, it's nice to end with a success story. It's inevitable, as we've seen through all the presentations this afternoon, that EdTech will become more and more central to teaching and learning. That's why it's so important that we understand how to make it a success. If you ask me, and this is good news, I think, most of what I've said today is basically common sense. Yes, every project should start with a needs analysis so that we can conceptualize the project in the round and lay proper foundations. Yes, we need institutional guidance and support, and that guidance needs to take into account group psychology. Yes, of course, we need professional development. But I feel there is one more element exhibited by the Shung Tak project that needs to stand behind all three of these guidelines, and that is sincerity. What Ms. Kwan showed so clearly is that if you go into the project honestly and sincerely, understanding the work that has to be done and not cutting corners, well, then this is the key. This is how you deliver positive outcomes to yourself, your colleagues, and your students. I know it sounds a bit old-fashioned, but sincerity is, above all, I think, the key to success. Thank you very much for listening. I hope there's some topics for discussion. Also, let me just give you my contact details. Andrew Stokes at ClarityEnglish.com. Do visit our website, Clarity English, and have a look at what we do.